Behind me is the grave of Yusuf Gervala, a left-wing activist and Albanian nationalist with the People's Movement of Kosovo, who was assassinated with his brother and another activist in a drive-by shooting in Germany. It's pretty obvious that the Yugoslav Secret Service sent an assassin to kill all three. Now, while he is mostly forgotten in English sources about the Kosovo War, it's important to understand the People's Movement of Kosovo and the more radical left-wing origins of the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the UCK. The 1970s and 80s were strange times for Albanians in Kosovo because the University of Pristina was renowned around Yugoslavia. It had some of the best education, but it led to a situation in which the people of Kosovo were very well versed on Albanian nationalism because the majority of courses being taught at Pristina were Albanology and liberal arts. What's more, Kosovo was not a constituent republic, it was only a territory. They didn't have the ability to pass their own laws, and after graduating, a job wasn't really guaranteed. So you had the biggest gap in literacy and the lowest infrastructure outside of Pristina anywhere in Yugoslavia. So in 1981, a series of mostly leaderless student protests began at the university. This really started out as demanding better quality food, better quality housing, a stop in the reduction of electricity that they were using, and it was immediately met by Yugoslav authorities with brutal violence and crackdowns. This led to several students being killed by police and military in the streets of Pristina, and what happened after this was the coalescing of more radical groups, because over the border in Albania, you had Enver Hoxha, who is considered the only non-revisionist communist state in the history of the Cold War, and he wouldn't die until 1985. So, seeing all of this happening, Gervala, his friends, and other student activists who were by now working with the protesters, they saw the protests crushed, and three separate groups came together to form the People's Movement of Kosovo, or PMK. This was composed again of three parties, and they were trying to figure out how they would coordinate to start an actual resistance movement in Kosovo proper. So they met in Istanbul with the ambassador of Albania, and basically it was agreed that they would go with the Marxist-Leninist Party of Albanians in Yugoslavia, the smallest group within those three parties, but the only of the three that didn't desire unification with Albania. They were seen as the voice of reason, so they led the charge in the insurgent movement that would emerge in the early 1980s. Now, at this point in time, Albania had many people living abroad as diaspora all across Europe, a large population being in southern Germany. The training camps for the People's Movement of Kosovo were located in Switzerland, and student activists would often go to Germany and then hop the border into Switzerland, where they could train with men like Yusuf Gervala. Now, because the People's Movement of Kosovo was guided by the Marxist-Leninist Party of Albanians in Yugoslavia, a lot of people had a bad taste in their mouth, but it seemed like their communist appeal was only on paper, and gradually they shifted more towards the political center. When Yugoslavia saw that more average, everyday people were starting to sympathize with these insurgents, they set out to intimidate and eventually assassinate the leaders of the People's Movement of Kosovo. And this happened in 1982 when someone rode up alongside the vehicle of Yusuf Gervala, his brother, and a separate independence activist who was riding in the car with them, who by most accounts that I've read wasn't really a militant activist at all. He just rolled in their circles but was more of an intellectual. For a long time, these three men were buried in Germany, but eventually, years later, their bodies were returned to their home village, and you can see around this cemetery, men and women with the surname Gervala are buried. It's a very well taken care of cemetery nowadays. Robbed of their most influential leader, the PMK would eventually fade into obscurity, but in its place, Yugoslav authorities did not intend for people to take up the mantle of these left-wing student activists and take a more middle-of-the-road approach towards Albanian nationalism. Eventually, Dr. Ibrahim Rugova would pick up the reins and have his own armed wing, the Armed Forces of the Republic of Kosovo, or FARC. Now, this group was fascinating in its own right because it was trained by the CIA out of Germany, which was the headquarters of the Special Activities Division, and in camps in Albania. I'm sure many of the contacts that were forged in Germany came from men like Yusuf Gervala, and although Gervala was forgotten for years, he was eventually awarded with the title Hero of the People after the independence of the country, and his remains were repatriated here. In the distance is Prekaz, where the infamous battle of 1998 occurred, but right behind it is the tower house featuring the shootout of Tahir Meha, who was an earlier predecessor to the Albanian nationalists that would later come to power during the Kosovo War. The village of Prekaz had another famous incident before the Gjashari siege of 1998. On May 13, 1981, Tahir Mena and his father Nebin fell in battle with state forces. Although surrounded 100 to 1, they fought for 4 hours until the tower house was totally destroyed. Meha's tower became a symbol of Albanian resistance around the time of the student protests of 1981. Meha's grandfather, Emil Ladi, was a member of the Cossacks during the early 1900s. He fought alongside Azem Galicia and led the armed resistance against Serbian rule in the 1920s. His father had participated in World War II as a soldier of Shaban Peluja, fighting Yugoslav partisans and Chetniks. Kosovo's incorporation to Yugoslavia wasn't as bloodless as the Yugoslavs led on, and I've interviewed people whose families were in the Bar massacre. The families in Drenica knew of the killings and resisted for months. This is the environment that Tahir grew up in, but rather than join the People's Movement of Kosovo under the leftist Nuhi Berisha or any of the other insurgent groups, he seemed to fight a personal war. Now, we'll never know the full extent of his guerrilla activities if he actually had any. However, he carried his grandfather's gun on him as a reminder of the Kochak Rebellion, especially powerful during the protests of 1981. On May 13th, 2 officers spotted a handgun and demanded he turn it over. He got into an argument, shot at them, and retreated to his father's tower house. The Yugoslav army deployed several battalions with tanks and helicopters. This was meant to be a warning to the protesters around the province. For 22 hours, the cops and army deployed tear gas and shelled the tower, but every time they tried to enter, one of their own was killed. At least 2 special police officers were killed in attempts to clear the door. I'm translating this and it says that 25 police officers died. This was a document from UDB archives that showed their plan of action to fire down from a helicopter on this tower house. If we take a look outside, you can actually see the original tower house is right over there. It took until 3 p.m. for the tanks to arrive and start striking the Kula, but one of the 2 tossed a grenade expertly into a porthole and damaged the interior enough to buy more time. After turning the tower into rubble, the Yugoslav army left it to the villagers to dig for the bodies and bury them. The 2 then became local heroes before Adem Gjashari came to the stage. And you can see here that his grandfather, Emin, fought alongside Azem Galicia in the Kochak uprising, and his father raised his son Tahir to have a patriotic spirit. In fact, he had several sons, one of which would be killed in 1999 in the fighting, an elderly man. Now, during that shootout in 1981, both father and son were killed, but they took down dozens of soldiers. These tower houses were actually very common throughout the north of Albania and in Kosovo. And it's fascinating to think that they were being used up till modern day. After all, these are literally portholes for guns. You can see them down there as well. And they're pointed out in the Yugoslav documents, police documents, that these all had firing positions. And you can see the monument set up to men like Gjashari, Tahir Meha, Skanderbeg, to the incident of 13 May 1981 that killed the father and son. and other members of their extended family commemorated along the wall up here. On the subject of early insurgent activity, Fahri Fazliu was an early member of the LPK, the People's Movement of Kosovo, a leftist group very loosely modeled after the ideology of Enver Hoxha. Unique about Kosovo was that they also had the highest number of both illiterate and college students, and the college in Pristina specialized in albanology and liberal arts. Jobs weren't guaranteed to students, leading to an unusual environment where every other person was highly educated, underemployed, culturally aware, and a physically fit person. This proved a breeding ground for the revolutionary spirit. The protests of 1981 began almost as impromptu sit-ins and blockades, demanding better food and no more waiting line for simple services, especially at the university. Eventually, after police cracked down on them, these activists became violent and demanded both nationalism and egalitarianism, many of which embraced socialism but rallied against Yugoslavism. Their final demand was to be a constituent republic, not a special province. These protests left 7 Albanians dead. Many men like Falziu brothers joined the People's Movement, which was formed under Nuhi Berisha in 1982. A few years later, the LPK was forced underground, and Fazri was killed in Pristina by a state security police in a dramatic shootout. This was in 1989. His brother Bahri helped found the National Movement for the Liberation of Kosovo, a much more openly Marxist-Leninist movement than the People's Movement, and after its first leader was arrested, he became the leader himself. In many ways, Bahri's liberation movement was a predecessor of the Kosovo Liberation Army, although later veterans would focus on the nationalistic sentiments over communistic talking points. These urban guerrillas often criticized Ibrahim Rugova for his moderate stance and held talks with the KLA. Days before the two movements were due to merge together, he was ambushed and killed on the border between Albania and Montenegro. Leftist insurgents like this are often overlooked for far less political revolutionaries in the KLA. The contributions of Tahir Zamai in the Kosovo War are often looked in English sources on the subject, but he is one of those early 2000s assassinations which are so mysterious. And one of the reasons he's so overlooked is because most people look to the contributions of the Kosovo Liberation Army. And indeed, he held the rank of general in the UCK, but he was also the commander-in-chief of Ibrahim Rugova's Armed Forces of the Republic of Kosovo, with an A, not an O. Now, this was the idea of Dr. Rugova, that he would create an autonomous republic within Yugoslavia by vote from the local committees. Now, this is interesting because for a decade, Tahir Zamai had attained a very high rank in the Yugoslav military, and he used his skills in that capacity to train about 100 or so people in the Armed Forces of the Republic of Kosovo, or FARC. Now, on the face of it, Tahir Zamai was very well known to Western intelligence authorities who viewed him as the perfect candidate to lead a resistance movement in Kosovo. After all, he'd worked with the Yugoslav military for a decade and had all of that experience under his belt. He also was a proponent of democracy and an Albanian nationalist, and this is exactly what was hooked up with him with Salih Chakai, a contactee or a informant for the CIA. He was somebody within Kosovo that would move back and forth between Albania and Yugoslavia, collecting sympathetic people, and because of his contact with Chakai, he was sent to Germany to speak with the Special Activities Division of the CIA. And to this day, his full involvement with the CIA is not really well known. In any case, this is sort of the nucleus of the armed forces of the Republic of Kosovo. People that the CIA knew had very good military training and also wanted either independence or to be joined with Albania. And at their helm was Tahir Zamai. But as often happens with officers who are trained by the CIA's Special Activities Division, very soon after the FARC was well equipped and ready to handle the task of beginning an insurgency, they were disbanded, and incorporated into the UCK, or the Kosovo Liberation Army. Now, at that point in time, the UCK, having not had the professionalism of the CIA's backing and training from the Albanian military, they were mostly composed of very left-wing people. And the fact that many of these officers were trained in the Yugoslav army, men like Zmaj, it off-put quite a few people in the UCK. Now, one of the first things that happened was that he was put as a deputy commander for the operational zone Duka-Gjin. And because of that, it caused internal division, enough so that Zmaj would defect. However, only 2 months later, he would return in an advisory role to one of the largest operations the UCK had ever seen. He became a hero to the Kosovo Liberation Army and to the people of Kosovo everywhere, but he was assassinated very quickly after the UN had begun to administer this area. Now, in much the same way that members of Dr. Ibrahim Rugova's political party were being killed in 2000, it seemed like mysterious deaths dogged people who were officers in his armed wing, FARC. This actually began at the Battle of Koshare, which is where most of these officers returned after defecting to provide assistance and guidance to the UCK. This included the CIA contact who involved Tahir Zmaj, that man's name again, Salid Chakai. Another man who was very infamously killed under mysterious circumstances was Agim Ramadani, again, another FARC commander who had gone on to advise the UCK. Although witnesses reported seeing Serbs rush his position and wipe out his local unit, some American journalists say that he was killed in a feud between the membership of the newly coalescing UCK and the more traditional CIA-trained men in FARC, which was led by Tahir Zmaj. And again, in late June 2005, another commander of FARC was found 6 years after he had disappeared. He disappeared right after the Kosovo War and was found buried in a shallow grave. He was Commander Rashid Mustafa, who led the Skanderbeg unit, a special unit which was considered the most elite of special forces. In any case, it seems like the men who were the higher-ranking commanders and officers of the armed forces of the Republic of Kosovo were dogged for years by these mysterious deaths, and all of these men had been trained by the CIA's Special Activities Division out of Germany. Behind me now is a large monument to the Kosovo Liberation Army overlooking the countryside, a testament to the Battle of Rezala, the first time the Liberation Army showed themselves to the public. Now, the KLA up until that point had been the culmination of many different groups coalescing throughout the years, but the first time they actually announced that they existed as a group you could join of militant fighters was after the Battle of Rezala, which happened in the pass right down the hill. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the story to sort of mark the beginning of the fight here in Kosovo. The Battle of Rezala would be the first time the KLA showed itself publicly in November 1997, and it was often called their first large-scale operation. Abdin Reksa was a local guerrilla loyal to Adem Jashari, and on November 25th, police tried to arrest him. He fought back, and 2 were killed on the Serb side. The resistance forced the police to regroup, and police intended to raid the same village the following day, but were ambushed on the 26th by Jashari and his men. In fear, they retreated through the narrow pass towards the direction of Mitrovica, but were engaged by nearly 24 Kosovo Liberation Army fighters. A monument right here now stands close to where this battle actually took place. The Yugoslav police retreated to the village of Lausa, where the Devic Monastery now stands. Sources are hard to find in English, but they either shot 2 primary school teachers incidentally, or used the school as a base of operation and just shot them because they were in the way. Both teachers were Albanian. On the 28th, they were given a funeral, which was attended by hundreds of locals. Furious about the murdered teachers, they issued a statement and the cops stayed away. At this statement, the Kosovo Liberation Army finally announced that it was the fighting force behind the insurgency up until that point. This narrow valley seems to have been the location of the Battle of Rezala, because if you're going in the direction of the community of Lausa from Mitrovica, this is where you pass through. And the battle is said to have happened in a valley as police attempted to make a retreat to Mitrovica. So I can see that happening here. And again, 24 Kosovo Liberation Army fighters just swept the floor with Serb police at that battle, after which they announced that the Kosovo Liberation Army was going public. Now, what's important to note about this is that the Yugoslav police and army now had Adjem Jashari and his supporters in their sights. They knew that these men were the main force behind the KLA. In early January 1998, they tried to raid Prikaz, his base of operations, to arrest him and his brother, and this was the second raid they tried to make, and the second time they failed. This was followed by more Albanians joining the Kosovo Liberation Army, and an acceleration of the conflict, which would eventually lead up to the murder of Jashari and his entire family, and the massacres at Liko Shan and Sirez, which happened a week before. And this is most likely the school in the community of Lauza, which was targeted at the Battle of Rizala by Serb police. And we're standing now on top of the memorial complex for that battle. And the school has since been named after one of the teachers who I would assume was killed here. You've got a bronze bust over here with his name on it and a death date of 1997, which is why I'm assuming that he was the one who died, but I can't find many sources in English which lists the parties that were involved. And here we are overlooking the massacre site of Liko Shan and Sirez, often thought to be one of the earlier massacres and possibly the beginning of the war here in Kosovo. And by the way, you can find this if you're making your way to the massacre site. It is right along the road, and as you turn left, it's near the sign for Godanj, right here at this intersection. Behind me is a small community of Liko Shan, and over the hills in this direction you've got Sirez, and it's in these two small villages that the massacres of the Kosovo War truly began. Understand that up until February 1998, the Serbian military and the Yugoslav police were more focused on the Drenica region of Kosovo because this region was understood to be almost entirely ethnically Albanian with a strong militant spirit, and specifically they had a base of operations in Prikaz. Well, the police also had a headquarters and an ammunition factory there, and they claimed that at some point around 11 p.m. on the 27th of February, they had an ambush. Now, early in the morning of the 28th here in Liko Shan, Albanians contacted the Human Rights Watch and said that they had heard shooting at a place they called Six Oaks. This was in the outskirts of the village, but what that says to me, and what the Albanians also related to the Human Rights Watch, was that they thought that this ambush had begun over near Prikaz, and there was a police chase. That led them to around this village, and the shooting happened in the outskirts at Six Oaks. Well, because of this, Serbian police related to the media that 4 police officers had been killed, but they also claimed that on the morning of the 28th, 3 separate police patrols were all attacked around this village of Liko Shan. So that led them with helicopter, APC convoys, and probably hundreds of Serb police and troops came into this village, and specifically to the Ahmedi family household, where the massacres truly began. Some of the more important aspects to remember about the ambush here at Sirez and Likoshan is the fact that Serb police had already fully prepared for an event just like this, because only days later they would begin an all-out assault on the community of Prikaz, killing Adem Jashari and his entire family. What's more, although the UCK was likely responsible, according to international observers, for the ambush on the 27th of several police near the community of Prikaz, they might have passed through this community, but certainly didn't stay here. They wanted to avoid targeting local families because they knew if they went into their homes, the Yugoslav police would have revenge attacks against entire communities, which is exactly what happened here. Again, the 27th in Prikaz, there was an ambush of police, followed by a short chase to this community in which they were shot near an area called Six Oaks. After that, Serb police claimed that on the 28th of February, the day of the massacre, several police convoys had been fired at in the outskirts of this village. They got here to the outskirts of the village on a hill overlooking the village at around 11:30 or noon, and it took them until 3 p.m. to actually make their way through these walls. And I'd like to point out something to you about the Ahmedi family house. It took the police until 3:30 to break through these barriers, or so they said. They were firing artillery, people witnessed this, but for some reason it looks like there are bullet holes in this wall, almost as though they're coming from the direction of the Ahmedi house. But what I want to point out is the brother that survived because he was in Sirez and came over the hill said he saw police the following day from 8 a.m. until around 3:30 p.m. firing throughout the village. Now, what tells me that the Ahmedi family was probably unarmed is the fact that all of these bullet holes in their gates were clearly fired from the opposite sides of the gates. Now, what's unusual is that if the police were in here and were trying to essentially stage an event which made it look like they came under heavy fire, they would stand at the family compound and fire towards the wall. Seems like they forgot to fire at the door. The Ahmedi family was the wealthiest family in the village and were bastions of their community. Now, immediately they were taken into an outbuilding and tortured. The neighbors reported they heard their screams for hours, and then they heard several shots. Now, it seems like they had all been executed in that outbuilding, and later American journalists would report that all of their bodies showed clear signs of torture, but people at the time didn't know they'd been executed in the village. In fact, one of the Ahmedi brothers survived the attack because he was in the community of Sirez. He heard the shots and waited for a little while until 8 a.m. March 1st, the following day, when he rounded the hill and saw that Serb police were fanning through the village, shooting randomly and firing artillery. He waited until 3:30 p.m. when he walked down into his family's house and found the place empty. Asking his neighbor what had happened, he said that his family had been taken by police. Now, the story would eventually unfold that they had been executed when an unfortunate discovery was made by accident at the city morgue in Pristina. Now, I would like to point something out in the interest of clarity here. On the right side of this monument, you've got the Ahmedi family who was massacred. Now, on the left, the top left, you've got two members of the Gieli family who were both affiliated with the UCK, but not acting in UCK capacity when the massacre began. Now, these were the Ahmedi family neighbors. You also have commemorated here their family guest who was staying in the Ahmedi family home at the time, an elderly man there, a middle-aged man. Now, even if these men were UCK and had just gotten back from an ambush in the Drenica region in Prikaz, this doesn't justify the massacre of an entire family. And by the way, it was the member of the family, the Gieli family, that was in Pristina who identified that the Ahmedi family was massacred. He saw their bodies in the city morgue. And this is from the second floor of the Ahmedi house. You can see one of the reasons it was chosen as an ideal target for the Serb police is because they wanted to send a message. The rest of the community of Likoshan could see this massacre taking place. And even if they didn't know it was a massacre at the time, everybody could see exactly what was happening. Now, if we pan around over here, the victims of these massacres were buried and this cemetery near Sirez overlooking both communities. And it is so eerie to walk through places like this. You can see on the wall there remains of fragmentation grenades. And here they could have taken a shower overlooking the hills of Drenica. One of the Ahmedi family cars. And as you can see, the community of Sirez is right on the hill overlooking the valley that separates them from Likoshan and the Ahmedi compound, which is where we're standing right now. So what it looks like to me, just an untrained person, is that the police began firing through this door and then launching artillery from the hills surrounding town at the Ahmedi family house for hours, knowing that they could hunker down and finally surrender once they breached the front gates, not realizing they would be executed after hours of torture. Then police went through and staged by shooting some of the walls around there, but not shooting the front gates because the front gates had been thrown open to allow them to enter the compound. They probably just forgot to shut them, so they're riddled with bullet holes that only go one way, proving they weren't really taking any fire in self-defense. In front of us in the valley here, we have the small village of Likoshan, to the left of which is the Ahmedi family home. And on February 28th until March 1st, 1998, 11 people were killed in this small community. Now, this was running concurrent with another massacre taking place in the community of Sirez. I hope I'm pronouncing all of these names right, but I know I'm probably doing a bad job at it. And it seems like the killings in this community were even less targeted. They were just going house to house and killing people. And these were the two men of the Gieli family killed in the massacres of Likoshan. And around us, we've got graves of other people who were killed in the local community, both with the UCK and as civilians throughout the Kosovo War. The massacre at Sirez began right after the massacre at Likoshan, and one of the first families targeted was the Nebihu family, and 27-year-old Rubika Nebihu was 7 months pregnant. Police burst into her home and shot her. Now, they also killed the eldest son, who's buried here next to her, and the father of these two told Human Rights Watch, quote, "The police destroyed my front gate with 2 tanks and came up to the windows of my house. About 17 policemen came out of the tanks. They wore military camouflage, green and yellow, with a police sign on their chests. No masks. The tank came up to the window. One policeman broke the window with the butt of his gun and started shouting. They said, 'Stand up,' and I said, 'Don't shoot, because there are only women and children here.' They cursed me and fired at me." Another family targeted by police was the Sejdiu clan, which was killed in Sirez. 4 sons of the same family were murdered: Bakim, Nazim, Bedri, and Bekir. Abdia Sejdiu, the mother of the household, told Human Rights Watch, "They, my sons, came to the field and we sat in one room. My daughter-in-law, 2 kids, and my son. We heard fighting in Likoshan around noon. My sons were killed around 4 p.m. The tanks came in the garden, they broke the gates, and 2 tanks were outside the firing. Some 7 to 10 policemen broke into the house and our room. I stepped in front of the police and put my hands in front of my sons. They took all of us into the garden. They say, 'Lie on the ground.' They hit Bakim, and I shouted, 'Don't you have any sons?' They hit me in my head with the end of the gun. They took all my sons, and I took the kids inside. The sons were then later found killed." And that brave mother, Abdia, is buried right here, in the middle of the sons she tried to protect. She only died in 2020. When I showed up to the Ajamdashari house, it was the day before Independence Day, and all day long, buses full of children have been coming in to commemorate the graves, to tell the stories and visit the museums. You even had soldiers guarding the memorial to make sure that no disruptions happen. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Ajamdashari because this is the first time most Westerners became aware of the egregious human rights violations taking place in Kosovo. He was born in 1955 in Prikaz to a large Albanian Albanian family in the Drenica region. Yugoslavs often considered this area a hotbed of separatism, and from 1991 to 1992, Jashari and about 100 other Albanians went to training camps in Albania proper, trained by their army and supposedly by CIA advisors. Initially, their training was in sabotage, so in late December 1991, his home in Prikaz was surrounded by Yugoslav police. Even though they had helicopters and a column of vehicles, they were pushed back by sympathetic locals in Drenica. Albanians lost none in this altercation, but the Yugoslav authorities lost 4. From this point, authorities avoided Prikaz as a rule, and Adem Jashari's rebels would use the area as a base of operations and planning. Every time an attempt was made to arrest the insurgents, they would repel them. Several more operations would follow, increasing to raids on police stations, and finally a pitched battle in 1997, after which the UCK, or the Kosovo Liberation Army, would go public. They would publicly declare that they existed. In March 1998, the army and police organized a full-scale mission into this village with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters. A nearby ammunition factory supplied artillery. The military began the operation with massacres in the surrounding area, and I'll talk a little bit more about those after this segment. This caused many Albanians to flee to Prikaz, who felt it was a safe zone under Adem Jashari. After all, the police and army more or less refused to go here. And this was the moment that the police and army decided to make a show of force. They loudly announced a 2-hour-long deadline, and Adem Jashari allowed many people in his home to leave, but told anyone who followed him into the fight that they would fight till the last man. His family he sent to an outbuilding anticipating the battle. Almost as soon as the deadline was over, shooting began, and a mortar almost instantly hit the outbuilding and killed many of his family, which leads me to think they were being targeted.
She was the only survivor. Jashari and 45 of his fighters and family were killed. 12 of the dead were women. 11 were young children.
The siege lasted 2 or 3 days, according to Yugoslav sources. Some sources also indicate they began to shell the farm, probably killing more people. When the Yugoslav army entered the home, they found that Adem and his brother Hamiz had fallen in battle. Jashari's wife and his 13-year-old son Kushtrim were also killed. Overall, about 58 were killed here, 18 of them women, and 10 children under the age of 16. The only survivor, Berseta Jashari, the daughter of Adem's brother Hamiz, claimed the police threatened her with a knife to say that Adem had anyone who wanted to surrender killed. That same day, the bodies were taken to Pristina for autopsy and then a remote warehouse outside of town. 1 day after, police announced they'd bury the bodies if nobody claimed them. 2 days later, the families exhumed the mass graves themselves and buried them in the field of peace. International backlash followed, and hundreds rushed to join the KLA. Last time I was in Pristina, I saw signs painted all over the wall saying, "Where is Ukshin Hoti?" So I thought I'd take you to his house to tell a little of his story. He was a genius, a professor of international law and then of philosophy at the University of Pristina, and his education was at the University of Zagreb and the University in Belgrade. He was a major in political science, but he furthered his education at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, and at the University of Washington. So he was a very intelligent man, and by the time of these protests, he also founded Unicom, the Party of Albanian National Union. Now, the Serbs accused him of endangering the Constitution of Serbia for his support of the student protesters, but he never said anything that could be possibly construed as incitement to violence, so they brought him in and out of jail quite a few times before eventually sentencing him to 5 years. And when he was due to be released was right in the middle of the Kosovo War. So 3 fellow prisoners took note when the guards said, rather than bring you home, you're due to be transferred for a clerical reason to the prison up in Nice. And he was never seen or heard from again. Now, during his time in prison, Amnesty International made his case very well known and considered him a prisoner of conscience. He was only really kept there because the war was ongoing, and it's almost certain he was killed, but to this day, the Serb authorities have not said where his grave is, and there's been no real thorough investigation of who was responsible for the murder. And of course, during the war, his house was struck purely out of spite. We're here in the small town of Rajčak, Kosovo, to talk about the Rajčak massacre, which was partly witnessed by observers in the OSCE, and the aftermath was documented by the man memorialized here behind me, William Walker, who has since become a hero to Albanians here in the Balkans. Now, the story can't really be told without a preface about William Walker's life. Walker, up until the late 1980s, served as a foreign service officer in many Latin American countries, and in 1997 was appointed the special representative to the Secretary General of the United Nations. In that capacity, he quickly came to lead the transitional administration of Eastern Slavonia, Boronia, and Sirmium. In this sort of capacity, the Serbs felt that he was forming preconceived ideas of what they were doing elsewhere in Yugoslavia, and what he witnessed in that transitional administration might have influenced his decisions on reporting later events, specifically the massacre here at Rajčak, whose documentation actually caused NATO to begin their bombing of Serb targets throughout this area. As a part of his work with the UN in the late 1990s, he had 800 UN peacekeepers and 2,500 military peacekeepers under his command. Following this, he was quickly given a title of Chief of OSCE Operations right here in Kosovo, and a part of that job entailed monitoring elections, reporting on roadblocks which were being set up by paramilitaries across the territory, and observing UN resolutions. Before the war, this small community had a population of about 2,000 people, but by the summer of 1998, the Yugoslav army moved in and more or less depopulated the town, sending the residents to live as refugees elsewhere. The reason for this, so they said, was because of geographical issues. This was rugged mountain terrain, and to get here from Prizren, you have to pass through quite a few narrow valleys, which provided excellent opportunity for insurgent attacks. Now, in this capacity, the UCK did use this community as a staging area for a number of ambushes, but as we've already discussed with the massacres at Likoshan and Sirez, they would pass through in a transient way and not use this as a headquarters or as a sort of base of operations. It wasn't fortified enough. They would go somewhere else more remote. In any case, by early 1999, the OSCE came to this village, and looking down from the hills, they saw smoke rising from a few chimneys and believed that there were about 300 people left living in this village, mostly children, elderly, or people who simply stuck around and refused basically orders on the part of the military and police to leave. We're on a hill overlooking the town of Rajčak, Kosovo, which is where the decision was made to begin the bombing campaigns over Serbia. This massacre was mainly just reprisals against the civilian population. Of course, a Yugoslav-Belarusian investigation found that every member who'd been killed was actually a member of the UCK. Then they brought in Finnish investigators who were not tied to NATO. And these investigators went short of declaring it a war crime, but did openly state it was a crime against humanity. And they found that even though the Serbian authorities said that they were all UCK, they found executions, they found elderly women, and they found many young children. And it was after this that NATO decided to begin their bombing campaign over Kosovo and Serbia to force Serbian authorities out of this area. And the 45 civilians killed are memorialized down in the village, further down the mountain. Up here on top you can see the Kola, which is where they memorialized the UCK fighters.
Homes in the village of Rajčak were still smoldering on Saturday, a day after Serb forces launched an attack on separatist Kosovo Liberation Army fighters. At first it appeared that a number of civilians had been caught in the crossfire. But international observers, led by the American William Walker, now say as many as 45 civilians were executed by Serb forces. Surviving villagers say the Serb police separated men from their families on Friday before herding them up a hill where they were shot. All the dead were wearing civilian clothing, among them a young woman, a 12-year-old boy, and many older men, including one aged 70.
It's hard to find words to say anything about it. This is about as horrendous an event as I've seen, and I've been in some pretty nasty situations.
While the West decides how to respond to the massacre, Serb police have already defended their actions in the village. They say the dead were armed rebels killed in combat and not civilians. They showed journalists a number of weapons they claim to have captured in the fight. But Western observers have described the massacre as a crime against humanity. They're urging prosecutors from the International War Crimes Tribunal to investigate.
Unfortunately, I do not have the words to describe my personal revulsion or that of all who were with me at the sight of what can only be described as an unspeakable atrocity.
Observers have urged Kosovan fighters not to be drawn into revenge killings and further jeopardize the unsteady ceasefire.
In mid-January, the KVM started hearing reports that people were being killed in Rachak. Before the war, this village had a population of about 2,000, but after the summer of '98, the army displaced most of them. By January, just before the massacre, the OSCE reported about 350 inhabitants. That the UCK had a presence here is clear from the monuments in the Kulla, including the reference, quote, "The Martyrs of the KLA, the operational area of Neurodima." The timeline seems to play out something like this. The KLA would rendezvous in depopulated Rachak, launching occasional ambushes. On January 8th, they ambushed police near Suva Reka, killing 3. One more officer was killed near Ferazaj 2 days later. Before January 15th, authorities began to cordon off the village. At 06:30 on the 15th, fighting erupted between the KLA and Serbs. The OSCE heard reports of clashes and sped to the site where they were refused access and watched the battle from a nearby hill. Later that day, they found 1 man dead and 1 injured in the village itself. On the 16th, they finally gained access, finding 40 bodies in and around the village. Reporters from around Europe who were attached to the OSCE mission reported that they were all in civilian clothes. Journalist Julian Strauss interviewed villagers and stated, quote, "A small group of men dressed all in black and wearing gloves and balaclavas coordinated the attack on the village and the subsequent executions, leading to speculation that they were attached to the Special Anti-Terrorist Unit." Now keep that in mind. On the 15th, after the battle, they were denied access to the community, but later that day they saw 1 man dead in town and 1 who was injured. He had been shot. Now on the 16th, they were granted full access by the Serbs, and they found 40 bodies in and around the local community. Locals were interviewed, and they said that what they had seen was a small group of masked men wearing balaclavas and all black, gathering people up and leading them off towards the hills outside of town. And the involvement of the French is a fact that is a little unusual and makes the reportage of the Rachak massacre a bit fuzzy, but you need to understand that France actually supported Serbia because they were an ally with Yugoslavia. After the massacre had been committed, they claimed that unnamed French diplomats and a small number of journalists had embedded with the Serb military, and that what had taken place on the 15th was a regular battle with the Kosovo Liberation Army. These claims were taken by Serbia and moved even further, who claimed that the men who had been shot had mostly been in UCK uniform, but that William Walker arrived with his OSCE on the 16th and dressed them in civilian clothes. Either that, or that they were dressed in civilian clothes by sympathetic Albanians. This was the claim that Serbia was running with, and they conducted their own investigation with somebody they thought was impartial, so it was a Yugoslav-Belarusian investigation, and that's what they found, that every person here who had been killed was in fact a UCK, or Kosovo Liberation Army fighter. But the observers on the ground found that that verifiably just wasn't true. There were very elderly and very young children who were killed in this massacre, many of them with execution shots to the back of the head. Now, even if you capture an enemy who is a legitimate adversary, killing them execution style is not a legitimate thing to do. It's a war crime. So if we were to look at this massacre very objectively and be as generous to French and Yugoslav forces as possible, what seems to be the case is that there were a couple of massacres about 2 weeks before the killing in this town began, and around the 14th or 15th, the town had been cordoned off because police blamed those massacres on this town, which was mostly depopulated at that time, about 350 inhabitants, being used as a staging area. After all, 30-minute drive through the valleys towards Suva Reka, where that massacre that killed 3 had taken place. They moved in at dawn and faced some minor resistance because, again, Even if there weren't UCK, a gun costs about $10 at this time because the government of Albania, only a couple years prior, had collapsed and all of their armories had been busted open. And if you see the military moving into your town and killing what looks to be innocent people, you're going to fight back. Facing this resistance and also being angry at the ambushes that had been perpetrated over the previous several weeks, the Serbs gathered these people together using their special anti-terror unit, the men dressed in black with balaclavas, and moved them outside of the town where they were killed. This might explain why some of the deaths look to be legitimate deaths in battle, like the ones seen by the OSCE on the 15th, the moment they were allowed in before they were allowed to fully explore the area, and it also explains why most of the people who were killed clearly were not combatants. Pretty soon, Finland was brought in, and Finland, who was not a member of NATO at that time, they only joined a couple of years ago, said that this was a crime against humanity and a massacre. Now, I'd like to take this moment to talk a little bit about the Serb allegations that have sprung up in recent years. So the pathologist Helena Renata was renowned in the Balkan Wars. She was responding to as many massacres as she could and determining the exact cause of death. In 2008, she remarked that William Walker had made her uneasy at some of the tasks he had put forward to her. He was trying to get her to say that this was a war crime, and what she felt uneasy at is the fact that as a pathologist, her only job was to determine what kind of ammunition had killed them and their manner of death. She was not supposed to make judgment calls that were expected of investigators that came from Finland or on the opposite side from Belarus, the Yugoslav investigators. And this is all she meant by the statements that she made in 2008. This is the gateway to the Battle of Koshare. It's about 10 kilometers up into the mountains. At 3 a.m. on April 9th, 1999, one of the most dramatic and important battles of the entire Kosovo War unfolded right here behind me, the Battle of Koshare. In the early hours of the morning, artillery began on the Albanian side of the border to strike the Yugoslav outpost in the small community of Koshare. And immediately after this, about 140 Kosovo Liberation Army partisans charged across the border and began close quarters combat. At that time, only about 200 soldiers were stationed at Koshare, and this would unfold over several days, and quite a few unusual events happened during this battle. The fighting at the Battle of Koshare continued all day, and most of the Yugoslav soldiers based here didn't really expect an equal fight, and not only were they proven wrong, they lost 23 men, and the Albanians only lost 4, with 1 gravely wounded. Now at about 7 p.m., they entered this area in full view of CNN and the BBC, while the Yugoslav army retreated and dug into the hills around town, eventually moving in their own special forces. This fighting continued in the valley from the 9th to the 13th of April, when eventually the Yugoslav army would clash with the KLA in the town of Krum, possibly in retaliation for the seizure of this base. And it was at this moment that many people went from viewing the KLA as a team of partisans and liberation fighters to an actual standing military. That's interesting. It says at the beginning of the battle, the fallen were originally buried at the Martyrs Cemetery in Bayramkuri, which is it was a partisan cemetery and a World War II cemetery under Hoxha in Albania during the Cold War. And these are two men whose deaths I'll discuss later on in the video, but Agim Ramadani was a commander in the armed forces of the Republic of Kosovo under Ibrahim Rugova, and his death was, as far as I remember, not really witnessed by anybody. He was an advisor to the battle and trained in the CIA by the Special Activities Division in Germany, and his contact in the CIA was Salih Chakai, who was likewise killed under somewhat unusual circumstances. I believe one of these men was killed possibly by an airstrike. There's some old gravestones over here on the outskirts of the cemetery. Now I can remember visiting last year the Partisan Cemetery in Bayram Kuri and seeing quite a few sort of ditches behind the cemetery, and I'm sure, looking back on it, that was the disinterment of the men buried here. The fighting continued up until the 14th, with the Yugoslav army digging into their positions around this area, and meanwhile the rest of the world's eyes turned to this little valley called Košare. Serbia began to claim, and they still maintain, that British, French, and American special forces were involved in this operation, at a minimum in the role of advisors, but possibly even on the ground as well. Meanwhile, it seems like the Albanian military was actually beginning to shell this position from a place called Mayaglava, a mountain on the Albanian side of the border. So the Yugoslav army sent in their own special forces and took the forests around Mayaglava, robbing the Albanians from that position, allowing them to fight for a little while longer. This could have qualified as a border incursion, but in any case, they quickly withdrew, and the trenches, 50 meters apart at Mayaglava, did not change positions for the entirety of the Kosovo War. A few UCK fighters, and I use UCK and KLA interchangeably because naturally UCK means Kosovo Liberation Army in Albanian, they have unmarked graves. So there you have it. The UCK took this mountain military base in the span of a few short days, perhaps with some advisors from the Albanian and a few foreign militaries. The Yugoslav government, meanwhile, faced a crushing propaganda defeat because this group of people that up until now they've only been referring to as insurgent terrorists managed to go up against a regular military force and win. So, in early May, they decided to try to take the base again, but were driven off by another barrage of artillery, this time fired from within the border. On the 10th of May, they sent in 2 T-55 tanks and only made it 100 meters into UCK-held territory before eventually being driven back after much bloodshed. And on that night, NATO forces bombed Yugoslav positions in the hills and mountains around Košare, killing 8 and wounding 40 Yugoslav troops. In one of those unusual incidents that happens after the battle, NATO again returned, bombing positions around this area, killing, according to the UCK, 7 of their own soldiers and wounding dozens. Why NATO would bomb the positions of people that they had already been supporting is a big mystery even to this day. And here at Košare you have people who survived the battle and are buried outside of the main cemetery of those who died during. And these were all men in the 138th Brigade, the most well-trained fighters. Many of these men would later go on to join the Kosovo police. You can actually see his police patch right there. But he served alongside these other men who fought the Yugoslav army right here. This is not on Google Maps, but I followed the GPS coordinates to the old military base, and I'm hoping to see if we can't actually find it. We're now on the final approach. Not sure if I like this bridge, but it seems sturdy enough. Whoa. We're looking now at the Tharanda Hotel, which was the site of the Prizren incident of 1999, one of the few confrontations between the Serbian army, or stragglers in the Serbian army, and KFOR troops. Now on June 12, 1999, KFOR personnel began arriving pursuant to a new UN security resolution, and the local military units of the Yugoslav army knew this. They were briefed on it, and they were very well expected to leave the area. About 600 troops were supposed to enter from where they had set up a base in Albania on the following day, the 13th. That morning, however, a small contingent of about 100 German soldiers were sent in to secure the area in advance of the larger group's arrival. Local Serb army officers were trying to buy time in the city, but they were convinced by German officers to leave on schedule.
You can take papers, the situation for papers in prison. You have to leave within 30 minutes, and it's 11 o'clock now. There's no moment, there's an order. That's the end of the discussion. You have now 28 minutes.
Almost as soon as they drove into the area, German troops began reporting sniper fire from some nearby houses and hills. Naturally, the Yugoslav army reported this was probably militants and not anybody affiliated officially with them. A German soldier then saw a Yugoslav army truck with soldiers in it brandish an AK-47 at a crowd of Albanians that were celebrating their withdrawal, and this Yugoslav soldier fired a few shots over their heads. So the German troops responded with machine gun fire at the Yugoslav truck, which quickly sped away, and as far as anybody knows, there were no injuries, but it shows how tense the situation in Prizren was. At dusk, a civilian vehicle, a yellow Zastava Scala, pulled up with two Serbian soldier stragglers in it. This vehicle sped towards German lines right here in front of Hotel Tharanda. These stragglers opened fire at the German checkpoint with AK-47s, and the German soldiers fired back. The driver was killed instantly, and his passenger died soon after of his wounds. The issue that the Yugoslav military took is just how outgunned the car was. Firepower coming from the Germans was so strong that it pushed the car backwards just with the force of the bullets. What's more, the firing continued for 20 straight minutes, most likely because the car backing up, the military felt it was probably trying to escape and reload their weapons or something along those lines, but it really was just the force of superior firepower. Both men were armed with guns and grenades, and a full video exists of this incident. I won't show you any of the gory details, but this just kind of compares and contrasts the modern-day locations in mid-2025 with the locations of 1999. Another odd fact to note about this operation is the fact that the civilian vehicle wasn't out of the ordinary. Because of the hasty type of withdrawal that the Serbian military was undertaking, most people leaving the city were exiting in their own vehicles. Here's video of tanks leaving the city, but most of them are just waiting in line inside of their personal cars with civilian clothing on. So a lot of arguments revolve around the fact these soldiers could have just been carrying weapons and trying to make their way out of the city. But every source I find says that firing was clearly heard coming from this car. I thought it might be difficult to find Tahir Sinani's grave, but he's buried right in the front of the cemetery just outside of Prizren. Not only did his reputation precede him in the Kosovo War as the commander of the 122nd Brigade and in charge of the operational area between Gjakova and Prizren, he was also a direct blood descendant of famous Albanian freedom fighters, most notably Miksokoli. After Yugoslav forces withdrew from Kosovo, Tahir Sinani continued commanding an entire operational zone of the Kosovo Protection Corps, the official and recognized police of this new territory. Now, because the insurgency in the Preševo Valley began, he felt a need to aid in their activities. Again, this was disavowed by NATO, but a lot of people who had fought with the UCK now found themselves supporting the UCPMB because for them, they wanted a sovereign territory for Albanians, and the borders of Kosovo for them simply did not encompass their entire territory. So this was something that a lot of people found themselves caught between two fires. After all, NATO would disavow them, but still, when they would be shot by snipers' bullets, this happened, they would often be evacuated by helicopter to places like Camp Bondsteel. So it was a on-again, off-again relationship that they had with international peacekeepers. After a number of agreements and ceasefires, the insurgency in the Preševo Valley came to a halt, and men like Tahir Sinani remained controversial because he still held a command position within the recognized Kosovo Protection Corps, and he was often accused of smuggling guns to insurgents which had picked up their activities under the new flag of the National Liberation Army beginning in early 2001 in Macedonia, trying to secure autonomous or independent status for the Albanian areas there. And in fact, he was almost certainly smuggling weapons to these, what he would view as freedom fighters, because on July 29, 2001, in Gostivar, an ammunition plant exploded, killing him and 4 NLA recruits because of his ties to Miksokoli and the fact that he never stopped fighting and worked multiple different sides of the conflict, ranging from NATO to the insurgents that NATO were calling terrorists. He became a national hero of Albanian patriots everywhere. Behind us is the grave of Commandant Ekrem Reksa, who was one of those mysterious assassinations of the early 2000s that we've been talking about. He was killed on May 8th, 2000 by somebody who had slashed his tires, and as he went out to change them, they shot him in the back. Now, the story here is that he was in the Yugoslav army during the beginning stages of the conflict and was ethnically Albanian, but he was more of a political moderate and only decided to join the KLA after hearing about the massacres at Likoshan and Sirez and seeing the wiping out of the Jashari family at the siege there. He decided to join forces with them and very quickly rose the ranks. After the war, he was known by NATO and the international administration as one of their greatest allies because he truly was trying to build bridges and promote peace among the Serbs and Albanians. He also helped to create the KLA Veterans Association, which promoted community involvement and an end to conflict. Because he was associating so closely with Serbs, this drew the ire of a lot of his former comrades, and on May 8th, he was assassinated. To this day, nobody knows who committed this assassination, and many of his former associates in the KLA were brought to trial or considered suspects, but eventually let go because there was a lack of evidence. It seems like this is one of many deaths under similar circumstances, and he was a very good military leader and an intellectual. He was going for his doctorate at the University of Canada at the time that he was killed. Another quick fact about Ekrem Reksa is that he was widely considered a shoo-in for the mayor of Prizren as a political moderate, and he's buried literally in the shadow of another fighter who continued the fight with the National Liberation Army while also commanding an entire operational area of the Kosovo Protection Corps, the recognized policing body of this new area. And that cemetery outside of Prizren is in the shadow of a very nice monument, and also it looks like a museum that's never quite been finished. Yes, this is the Martyrs Museum, and the fighting in Prizren was some of the worst in the Kosovo War. It's not open, but you can see they have a wall of some of the local heroes of the conflict. By the year 2000, Kosovo was governed by an international peacekeeping force, and the UN was securing their elections. But in the lead-up to these elections, a number of prominent politicians within the Democratic League of Kosovo were assassinated. In fact, they actually went to the UN and told them that they feared for their lives. The reason for this is because the Democratic League was a more intellectual-minded political party headed by Ibrahim Rugova, a doctor who is incredibly famous here in Kosovo and even has a statue and a central square in this town. Well, one of the first people to be killed was Rugova's friend, Gmail Mustafa, a fellow League member. He was killed partly because, a lot of people think, he was the vice president of the Serb Socialist Party's local branch in the Preševo Valley. He was also associated with Ibrahim Rugova. He was trying to build bridges instead of to tear them apart. Now, he was killed at the beginning of the UCPMB insurgency in the Preševo Valley in 2000. Following him was another man who actually survived the assassination attempt. This man, Avni Saliu, was the leader of the Ministry of Sports and Culture in his local town in southern Kosovo, and he was targeted with a bomb placed in his home. That bomb attack actually killed his wife and child, but he managed to survive. But only days before the bombing of his house, the body of Shaban Manai was found, who was another prominent member of the Democrat League of Kosovo. Manai was a prominent lawyer in this town and a close friend of Dr. Ibrahim Rugova, and on July 23rd, two young men stepped into his office and asked if he could take the case of another young man, one of their friends, who was imprisoned in a nearby town. However, they said that the man's parents were bedridden, and they asked Manai to accompany them to the parents' house. He was then missing for 2 weeks until his body was found burned in a village a couple of miles away from here. Now, after this, 5 people were taken in and charged in the local court, but they eventually were all let go due to a lack of evidence. But the main suspect the police had, a man named Mark Oroshi, started taking to drinking, and eventually, when he was drunk, he would let some names slip. Well, very quickly, he was assassinated in his own backyard. So it seems like there were a lot of very targeted assassinations, and the reason for this is because, as pointed out by the UN, who believed that the Democrat League of Kosovo would be successful in these elections, is because the men who joined the Democrat League were usually better to do than the men who were part of the Democrat Party. The Democrat League of Kosovo, during the war, by and large, their members could leave to somewhere else in Europe or to the United States, whereas the people who were coalescing around Hashim Thaçi's Democrat Party were the ones who stayed and fought. So when lawyers and doctors and professors returned after the war, this drew a lot of animosity from other people. And what's more, the Serbs actually sought to drive a wedge between the League and the party, and for the first few years of Kosovo's independence, many assassinations, like the ones I've already spoken about, would take place, and very often they would not be solved. And by the way, this mosque, the Al Aga Mosque, is the oldest in the Balkans, dating to 1289, a century before the Battle of Kosovo Field. We're here in the beautiful town of Dragash in southern Kosovo, and I want to kind of pan around and show you this community because it really does have some breathtaking snow-capped mountains and is an amazing place. But I want to talk about the August 9th, 2000 attempted assassination of a rising star in Kosovo politics, Avni Saliu. He was a member of Dr. Ibrahim Rugova's Democratic League of Kosovo. And these people did express concern to the UN that it felt like they were being targeted by certain elements within Kosovo society. Now, on the morning of August 9th, he was away from home, and a bomb exploded in his house, which took the life of his wife, Ganymede, and their young child. Now, this is something that has never been solved, as are most of the murders that happened in the early 2000s. But I think it is very sad and very indicative of inter-Albanian conflicts in Kosovo right after the withdrawal of the Yugoslav forces. We've already talked a little bit about Jemail Mustafa and a few other men who were killed mysteriously in the early 2000s and right after the end of the Kosovo War, after the withdrawal of Yugoslav forces. Now, Avni Saliu was a rising star in Kosovo politics. He was a member of Ibrahim Rugova's Democratic League of Kosovo, and as I've discussed before, a lot of people felt some kind of a way about these Democrat League members. Today is Kosovo's 17th Independence Day, and I'd like to take the time to tell the story of Jemail Mustafa, a close friend of Ibrahim Rugova, and his mysterious assassination in 2000. Now, to understand a little bit about the political background of these events, you need to understand that Rugova and Mustafa, along with other intellectuals in the Albanian national movement in Yugoslavia, were advocating not for total independence or for a greater Albania. These men, which would later form the Democrat League of Kosovo, only wanted more autonomous status within Yugoslavia. Genuinely, they wanted to foster friendly relationships among peoples. Well, this became untenable after a certain period of time, and a lot of the intellectuals from the Democrat League of Kosovo were forced to flee as the insurgency increased, which was waged mainly by the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the UCK. Then, fast forward a few years, and after the Yugoslav and Serb forces leave Kosovo, international peacekeepers come in, and the UCK by and large demobilizes. However, it wasn't uncommon to hear veterans say, "I fought for this rifle, I'm not turning it in." And these same veterans who refused demobilization orders continued their insurgency in the Preševo Valley with a new group, this one called the UCPMB. And right after that insurgency began, many men like Jemail Mustafa and other League members were being killed. This was a string of unusual assassinations which still to this day has not been solved. In fact, Jemail Mustafa's daughter has urged investigators to research the involvement of the Kosovo Intelligence Service, which she believes might have something to do with the death of her dad. Overlooking the town of Kumanovo, we have a cemetery here for those killed in the insurgency of 2001. And among Albanians who are sort of patriotic-minded and want a greater Albania, there are no greater heroes than Bekir Sadiku and Jacob Osipi. Now, what I've talked about a little bit before is the fact that at the time in Yugoslavia, one of the areas with the least developed infrastructure was Kosovo, but this same area also had one of the best performing universities. On top of that, their government wasn't able to pass laws of their own. They could only veto laws that were passed in Belgrade, and after Milosevic took over, even that was removed from them. So now you have a bunch of students from this university who are very well versed in liberal arts and Albanology, and the students are nearly all Albanians. And when they leave, they go back to their farms and they don't have any jobs guaranteed. This is exactly what the family of Bekir Sadiku was when the KLA really began and when the insurgency in Kosovo was at its height. And during the Kosovo War, there was a call for a general mobilization of any Albanians who would go and join them. One of those men was Bekir Sadiku, who quickly made a name for himself at border clashes along the Albania-Kosovo border. After this, he joined the Kosovo Protection Corps, which was the legitimate policing structure of Kosovo under international administration. But on the side, as did many other people, he worked closely with the UCPMB to keep that insurgency simmering in the Preševo Valley. See, Preševo was still a part of Serbia, still a part of Yugoslavia, but it was almost entirely ethnically Albanian, and many of the Kosovo Protection Corps men who still had that militaristic spirit in them, they desperately wanted to keep that fight going. So while he was a legitimate police officer, he was also working with that insurgency group, and mostly they called him Commander Slupjane because he came from this village around here, and I apologize if I'm getting any of the names wrong here, but this is at the Macedonia, Serbia, Kosovo tri-point, and he knew the area like the back of his hand, so naturally when the insurgency in the Preševo Valley was over and mostly demobilized, he picked up the insurgency right here around the Macedonia area under the National Liberation Army. So in May of 2001, the UCPMB officially demobilized. They turned in their weapons and surrendered, and the fight was picked up later that month by Ali Ahmedi's National Liberation Army, and Commander Sadiku actually was the representative in this local village of that army. Now, the police immediately captured most of the areas controlled by the NLA along the Kosovo-Macedonia border, but for a month, they couldn't capture this hometown, his backyard basically, and he held it until he was killed at the end of June. Mullah Jacob Osipi is buried here behind me, and he was an incredibly influential man in promoting the Albanian history of the Karadak region, the northern part of Macedonia, right along the Kosovo border, and in describing how this region had firm roots in Albanian history. Many Albanians live here, and it's a largely Islamic community. Now, he was mostly educated in the local area, but he did have secondary education in Damascus, Syria, and in Lebanon. So from 1985 until 1990, he was an imam in Germany, but around the 1990s, he returned to his homeland when the insurgency began, and police would often suspect him of aiding these insurgents, but he always seemed to get out of interrogations, very rough interrogations, basically because of a lack of evidence. He either wasn't affiliated with them at that time, or he was very good at covering his tracks. Now, Osipi, much like many of the men who actually died in this early 2000s insurgency, was a highly educated man, and he did in fact lead the 113th Brigade in what they were calling the Free Zone of Karadak, which was basically their attempt at creating a self-governing Albanian autonomous area within Macedonia. The police would accuse him, as well as state authorities in Macedonia, of running mujahideen camps because of his time spent in Syria and in Lebanon, but his family said that he was not a radical Islamist. He only fought for Albanian national interests. Following in the footsteps of Ali Ahmedi, Asipi was elected the Mufti of Kumanovo and Lipkovo and threw his hat in for national leadership roles. However, on January 7th, 2006, he died in a pretty unusual car accident, and 15,000 people came to attend his funeral. I am not really aware of all of the details of this car accident, but it does seem a little bit strange that a man so important would die in such a way. You can see here another commander. I'm not aware of his story, but I'll have to come back someday and tell it. And by the way, I do want to tell the stories of the Macedonians and Serbs as well next time I come back. But he died in Malin, but many of these other men died in Slupčan in mid-2001, and I believe this would have been in the free zone of Karadak, where some of the heaviest fighting occurred. And you can see a lot of these folks were born here as well. And another commander, Afrim Kalanicha. Many of these men certainly would have been friends, having been born in this small community as well, right outside of Kumanovo. Commander Shinazi Ibrahimi, buried just down the way from Sadiku. For some of these men, the war was intensely personal, such as for Arifi. You can see Gilan is one of the towns that the NLA was sort of birthed from. The UCPMB was mostly coordinated right in that town because the Preševo Valley was right over the mountains, and it's where the Kosovo Liberation Army fighters who refused to demobilize sort of gravitated. And Kamberi here may have even been a little bit too young for the Kosovo War, but he was born in Rejec. The infamous massacre and the discovery or the reporting on that by William Walker and the United Nations is what inspired NATO to begin bombing campaigns over Kosovo in 1999. Commander Demiri was born in Kumanovo, just down the way. Slupčan is a small village between this cemetery and Kumanovo, which we've been sort of zooming into. And a lot of these men are, like I said, from this town. The Zimberi family as well was a local clan that was very active in the insurgency. All three of these men died in this community. And three more Zimberis, Neil, Niraman, and Fitor, two of them born in Slupčan. And the two Zimberis here are buried closest to the cemetery gates. And I didn't think that this tower would be open. Certainly doesn't look like it's been cleaned in a little while. But it looks like it gives a nice overview of Kumanovo, where much of the fighting took place. And in here is a small museum dedicated to the UCK and the National Liberation Army that continued fighting in Macedonia after the end of the Kosovo War.
Continue on R 29,272 for 2 kilometers.
And this is Slupčan.